Bones and skeletons make great features on both terrain and dioramas, and this week I've been experimenting on a couple of bits that use them as centerpieces to add a high fantasy, spooky or post-apocalyptic vibe. What makes these pieces different though is I made them using the remains of a roast chicken, and you can too, and I'm going to show you how. I'm Benji and welcome to Benji's Hobbies. This is a bit of a strange way to start off a hobby video, and whilst I'm sure you're thinking you've somehow accidentally stumbled onto a random cooking channel, I can assure you that this is still a terrain making video, so please stick with me. This video begins with a rotisserie chicken that I picked up pre-cooked from my local supermarket. You could just as easily cook your own at home and still have the same, if not more delicious results, but because I was feeling lazy, this felt like a far easier option for making this video. Once we'd had dinner and eaten all the easily accessible meat, I completely stripped the chicken and I was left with a small pile of greasy bones which had some stubborn bits of meat and gristle left on them. I drew some hot water into a washing up bowl and added some washing up liquid and added the bones, leaving them to soak for about 10 minutes before properly getting to work on them. The washing up liquid helps remove the grease and loosens any of the stubborn bits of meat. To fully clean the bones and make them ready for use, I used an old toothbrush to give them a scrub, paying particular attention to the deepest recessed parts. Once I'd given them a scrub, I wanted to make sure that bones are fully dry, and that any remaining material that might decay or start to smell in them was gone. So I put them on a foil sheet in the oven at 200 degrees centigrade or 400 degrees Fahrenheit for around 90 minutes. Be careful when you take the bones out of the oven as they will be hot, so make sure you let them cool before you start handling them. They do smell a little chickeny and will do for a couple of days, but I can assure you that this smell definitely starts to disappear over time and won't be noticeable once you've coated them in paint and varnish. First up, I want to build something that looks a little bit more realistic, and I've had an idea in mind for a while. For Christmas, I was lucky enough to receive a 3D printer, and like most people who have a 3D printer, one of my first prints was a Mandalorian, so my plan is to make a small diorama incorporating one of my first prints. Whilst this is going to be a diorama, there is nothing stopping you from applying what I do here on your terrain pieces or onto wargaming tables, as all of the skills and techniques are definitely transferable. I'm going to build a diorama so that it fits into this 6x4 inch photo frame, which will act as a display plinth or a base. I'm going to use the back of the frame as my starting block so that I know how much space I've got to play with. I started by removing all of the fixings and attachments, so I've got a clean slate to work with, before cutting some 6mm XPS foam slightly oversized for the piece. I also roughly broke up some spare bits of 6mm foam to add raised areas on the floor of the diorama, and finally I used some thicker foam to create a small backdrop. I'm not really focused too much on the shape or size of these at the moment because they'll be covered over and can be cut down a bit more later on. I glued all of these parts together using some polyurethane Gorilla Glue and used some kebab skewers to add some extra rigidity and strength to the back piece. To add a bit more depth and texture to what will become the rocky background, I made some plaster rocks using a Woodland Scenics mould and some Geek Gaming casting plaster. Once these are cured, I glued them in place using some hot glue. Whilst the bond isn't particularly strong, it's enough to hold them in place for now until some later steps where I'll be firming this up. Next, I cut away any excess foam that overhangs the wooden base and around the rocks using a hot wire cutter. Whilst I'm doing this with an expensive piece of kit, you can just as easily do this with a sharp hobby or craft knife. It's just that because I've got the toys, I kinda want to get some use out of them. Now at this stage, I want to see what bones would feature in this diorama and test fit a couple of different options. I have a selection of shapes and sizes and wanted to make sure that I was using ones that were appropriate for the scale of not only the diorama but the models that would feature on it as well. I opted to use some of the smaller bones and make them look like ribs sticking out of the ground, as though they were partially covered by the desert sand, which would work really well with the scale I'm working at. Once I was happy with the composition, I mixed up a batch of Geek Gaming modelling compound and spread it across the floor of the diorama and around the rock moulds before fitting the bones in their final positions, slightly embedded in the compound. As this starts to dry, you can wet your fingers and use them to smooth out the compound to create a natural look and help blend in some of the rocks, raised areas and around the bones. To help blend in the rocks a little more, I mixed a batch of casting plaster and shaped this around the rock moulds and carved in some detail using a sculpting tool and a stiff brush to create some striation. Once all this was dry, I cut away any compound that was overhanging any edges with a hobby saw so that it all lined up. This unfortunately left some slightly rough edges, so to give the diorama sides a nice smooth finish, I used some extra fine filler to coat the sides and back and used my finger to smooth this out, using some water to help smooth it a little easier. When this was dry, I gave it a sand with some fine grit sandpaper and gave it another very thin coat of filler to give a final smooth finish. Next, I needed to paint the diorama and I wanted to start with undercoating the bones. To protect the rocks, which I didn't want to get any undercoat on at the moment, I masked them off with some frog tape and gave the bones a quick blast of black spray. After removing the masking tape, I mixed up a selection of different craft paints, including orangey browns, ochres and ivory into super thin washes and apply them using the leopard spot technique on the rocks. Although the floor of the diorama is going to be completely covered, I did decide to give it a quick coat of paint using a mix of ochre and ivory to give a somewhat dark sandy colour. Once this was dry, I went over the entirety of the rocks with a black wash to help blend all of the colours together and take away some of the harshness out of the original colours. Next up was painting the bones. As these have loads of texture to them, including lots of deeper, dark recesses, dry brushing worked really well on them, starting from a dark bone colour, working up through ivory, and finally into an off-white colour on the most raised and exposed edges. This gave a really natural looking warm colour to the bones, and really helps them stand out as a feature on this diorama. With all the painting done, I started adding in some of the ground textures, starting with Geek Gaming Desert Sand and Stone mix on the areas around the base of the rocks. I applied a slightly thinned down PVA and water mix to the areas I wanted it before liberally sprinkling the mix over the top. I then watered down the PVA even further to a ratio of about 1 part glue to 10 parts water and carefully pipetted it over the areas that still looked a little loose, or where I've built up thicker layers of material. Once the glue had fully dried on the first material, I then covered the rest of the floor with tropical sand, which is a super fine sand. Again, gluing this in place with a slightly diluted mix of PVA and water, before applying a much more watered down glue over the top to lock it all in place. Whilst I'm super happy with the ground coverings, I wasn't overly happy with the colour that the rocks have turned out, so I gave them a light dry brush with a mix of grey and sand coloured paints to help them blend in a little more with the ground cover. With the main work done on this diorama, it's time to move on to the main centrepiece, which is the Mandalorian. As I don't have a Baby Yoda or Grogu painted off, I decided to paint him in the older armour style to reflect that this scene may have taken place before the events of the TV series. I'm not the best painter, and if you're here expecting perfect edge highlighting and creamy blends, then you're definitely watching the wrong channel, but overall I'm happy with how he turned out and he was really fun to paint. I'm really impressed with the sculpt and the quality of the 3D print from my Elegoo Mars, and I really feel that this sort of model represents my style of painting pretty well. I pinned him to the base of the diorama, and to tie the whole model together I added some dry pigments to give it a really dusty look. And with that, the diorama is done. The bones really stand out as a feature on here and definitely add to that desert look, as though they've been picked clean by scavengers. Whilst this really is a simple diorama, I'm really happy with how it's turned out, and I'd be more than happy to have this displayed on my shelf. So I still have a few bones left over, so thought there might be some other way to incorporate them into some other terrain pieces that could be used on the tabletop. I found some Skull STL files on Thingiverse and printed them out and started laying the bones out into some rough layouts. I cut some bases out of 5mm Foamex sheets and beveled the edges with a knife and some sandpaper. I got some leftover rock molds from the diorama and glued them alongside the bones where I wanted. I mixed up another batch of modelling compound to build up the ground areas and smoothing it out to blend in the rocks and hide where the bones are attached to the base. Once it was dry, I simply followed similar steps as I did with the diorama, painting over the ground and undercoating the bones and painting them with increasing white tones, finishing off with a pure white this time. I used a couple of different base ready mixes as ground cover, glued down with PVA, and finally added some grass tufts and flock to finish them off. I'm really pleased with how these quick pieces have turned out. The dragon skeleton would work great as scattered terrain for most fantasy games, whilst the elephant skull would look awesome as a Haradrim or perhaps 4th Age Pelennor Fields terrain. Bones like this would also be great for representing dead gargants or giants, and I would love to see something like this used on the base of a model as well. I want to give a huge thanks and shout out to Lewis Collins, who gave me the inspiration for this video, and for all the help that you've given me in planning this video out. So what do you guys think? Would you use leftover chicken bones to make terrain, or is this something that you're inspired to do now that you've seen this video? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below, and if you'd like to help me buy more rotisserie chickens to make pieces of terrain like this, then consider going and checking out my Patreon or Element Games affiliate links, which you'll find in the description below. As always, thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.